Thank you, Madam Chairman. Attorney General Garland, in your Senate confirmation hearing, you referred to the January 6th protests as the, and I quote, most dangerous threat to democracy in your law enforcement and judicial career. In that same hearing, you even compared January 6th to the Oklahoma City bombing case you worked on, where 168 people were killed. In June 15th, a speech announcing a new enhanced domestic terrorism policy, you cited January 6th as a motivation for that new policy. You went on to describe January 6th, and I quote, as an assault on a mainstay of our democratic system. You have said that prosecuting extremist attacks on our democratic institution remains central to the mission of the Department of Justice. So suffice it to say, it's clear that you feel very strongly about using the full force of your position to prosecute those involved in the January 6th protests. What is not clear, however, is if you will use the same force against violent left-wing domestic terrorists. Just last week, on October 14th, a group of extremist environmental and indigenous protesters forced their way into the Department of Interior. They fought with and injured security and police officers, sending some of those officers to the hospital. The extremists violently pushed their way into a restricted government building in an attempt to thwart the work of the Department of Interior. Police arrested at least 55 protesters on site, but others got away. Mr. Garland, do you believe that these environmental extremists who forced their way into the Department of Interior are also domestic terrorists?
I'm not going to be able to reference that specific incident since this is the first I know about it, but I will say that the department does not care.
So this is the first that you know about an incident where protesters forced themselves into a federal government building right here in D.C. Like you didn't hear about this at all?
This particular example, it doesn't mean the Justice Department doesn't know about it, but I personally haven't heard about it before, what you're saying right now. But I want to be clear, we don't care whether the violence comes from the left or from the right or from the middle or from up or from down. We will prosecute violations of the law according to the statutes and facts that we have. This is a nonpartisan determination of how to do that.
All right, I'll make it a little clearer for you. And most of us are lawyers here, so we use evidence in court. So you got two pictures here. One picture is from January 6th of individuals forcing themselves into the Capitol. This other picture is extremists forcing themselves into the Interior Department. So looking at these pictures, and I know you say you're not aware of this, which blows my mind that you're not aware of violent extremists forcing their way into a department right here in Washington, D.C., into a federal building. But just with these evidence, with these two pictures that you see here of people forcing themselves into a federal building, would you call both of these acts domestic terrorism?
Look, I'm not going to comment about particular matters. This is a matter that...
I'm not asking you to comment on a particular... I'm asking you to comment on these two photos. You have two pictures of individuals forcing themselves into a government building right here in Washington, D.C. And one, you as I laid out, very welcomely call them domestic terrorists, but you're refusing to call groups like this, who commit the same atrocities here in Washington, D.C., domestic terrorists.
One I know the facts of, the other I don't know the facts of.
Well, I'm showing you pictures. Here's facts right here. If you want, we'll act like we're in a courtroom. Exhibit A, Exhibit B. January 6th, Department of Interior.
Well, as you know,
based on these pictures of people forcing themselves into the...
One picture is not going to be I'm not going to be able to resolve a legal determination based on one picture. In the January 6th case, we have terabytes of video which disclose exactly what happened.
Speaker Pelosi, mindly, still hasn't released to the American public to view all that video that has been captured here in Washington and in the Capitol complex. But that's the problem that everyday Americans are facing right now, is they see these type of comments that you've made about January 6th, yet you're completely, and you're not answering my question now, and you're saying, well, that's an ongoing investigation and I don't know about it. But clearly, based on the pictures, clearly what has occurred, factually what's been widely reported in all sorts of different American outlets, that these individuals forced themselves into a building here in the Department of Interior, and you're refusing right here today before the American people to say, yes, that's the same type of activity that I'm going to bring the full force of the Department of Justice to come against, regardless of the ideology which you have said in the past, but you're refusing to do that today. And that's the problem with the challenges that this administration, your department is facing, is everyday Americans who are seeing this on TV, and now you have the opportunity to set the record straight and say both of those actions, regardless of ideology, are against federal law and will be prosecuted with the full faith and credit of the Department of Justice, and you're refusing to do that. And that's the challenge that everyday Americans are having right now, is because they're seeing what you guys are doing to the people on January 6th, to the point where even a judge is saying that the speaker before me had 30 extra seconds. I asked the same deference that you gave to the previous speaker. That you have even judges who recently even held the Department of Corrections in contempt related to the way that the January 6 suspects have been treated, and you're refusing to even comment on the very acts that have just occurred here. And that's what is horribly wrong, and it is happening in our country, that the American people are seeing your refusal to answer those questions.
Mr. Attorney General, members, votes have been called on the House floor, so the committee will stand in recess until immediately after the conclusion of those votes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Attorney General. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your leadership of the Department of Justice. I also want to thank my colleague, Representative Bass. I know she engaged in a line of questioning earlier about the tragic death of Elijah McClain in my home state of Colorado. I was heartened to hear that the department is engaged in a review of its use of force policies. We've introduced a bill to ban the use of ketamine in custodial settings. That bill has earned the support of Chairman Nadler and the subcommittee chairwoman, Sheila Jackson-Lee, of which I'm both grateful, and certainly we will welcome the opportunity to work with your department on that particular legislation in honor of Elijah's memory. On March 22nd of this year, as you know, my community of Boulder, Colorado experienced a horrific tragedy as a gunman killed 10 people at our local grocery store using an AR-15 style pistol, which fired rifled rounds with a modified arm brace. The AR pistol brace attachment used by the gunman allowed the shooter to fire an easily concealable pistol with rifle-like accuracy and firepower. In the immediate aftermath of this tragedy, as you know, I sent a letter to the President and to the Department of Justice, along with 100 of my colleagues, requesting the administration use its authority to regulate concealable assault-style firearms that fire rifle rounds. And as I mentioned to you when we last met at the White House in April, I was very pleased with the administration's announcement that DOJ would be issuing a proposed rule within 60 days to tighten regulations on pistol stabilizing braces, as I requested in my letter. And so I want to thank the department and wonder if you might be able to opine as to the status of the rule, of where you are in the rulemaking process.
Well, I believe that we're still in the rulemaking process. I can't remember whether the comment period has closed or not, but you know, as part of the Administrative Procedure Act, as you know, we have to go through a rulemaking procedure, and that's what's going on here to prevent the pistols from being used as short-barreled rifles, which are prohibited.
Well, again, I appreciate the department taking that proposed rule seriously. We certainly look forward to the results of that rulemaking process, as do my constituents in Boulder, who are still very much grieving the loss of so many in our community. Two other subjects I wanted to address in my limited time. First, around grand jury material. Now, I know, Attorney General Garland, I think you'd agree with me, so current law allows for grand jury material, known as Rule 6E material, to be released publicly after 30 years. That's current law. Is that right?
Actually, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I don't think that's correct. We have made a recommendation to the Federal Rules Committee that it be released. I think 30 years is the time, but Rules Committee has not yet decided whether that would be the case. But that is, I think 30 years was the number that we recommended.
So we think that's the subject that I was sort of wanting to dig in on. My understanding is that current law provides for 30 years. The Trump administration in 2020, a senior Trump administration official, or a lawyer rather, at DOJ, proposed that the time period be extended to 50 years. And my understanding is the Department of Justice has continued that request and made that request for the time period to be extended to 50 years. As you can imagine, there are a lot of concerns, many of which I hold and many of my colleagues hold, around judicial secrecy, and the extension of the time period to 50 years would seem a bit much. You know, if were that to be adopted, many of the materials released post-Watergate would still be secret today. So I would certainly...
So we have sent another letter post the letter that you were speaking about to the Rules Committee. There's no reason why we can't share it. It's not a private letter or anything. And it went back, I think, even a shorter period than the Holder letter originally was, So I'll ask my staff to get that for you.
Well, that's terrific to hear. So thank you, Attorney General. Thank you to the department for making that change. And I think that that is going to allay many of the concerns that folks had, certainly mine. So I appreciate the Department of Justice doing that. Finally, last question. National Substance Abuse Prevention is this month. I know my colleague from Florida, Representative Deutsch, asked you a couple of questions with respect to the opioid epidemic that is pervasive across our country, including in my state in Colorado, where on average 2 Coloradans are dying a day from opioid overdoses. The department has worked with us on a bill that we introduced, the Preventing Youth Substance Abuse Act, and I want to thank DOJ for their partnership in that regard, and just wanted to give you an opportunity before the hearing concludes here this afternoon to add anything else further you'd like to add with respect to your answer to Representative Deutsch about the department's work to address this epidemic. And I think there's bipartisan interest in the Congress in partnering with your department to ensure that those solutions are applied broadly across the country, including in my state of Colorado.
So this is a terrible epidemic. I went to the U.S. Attorney's offices all across California, also in Tucson, to find out what's happening with respect to the importation of this fentanyl. It is, I would say, our most #1 concern now because these pills are something like 4 out of 10 pills. It's like playing Russian roulette. If you take one of those, you die. And the kids who are taking those have no idea that that's what's happening. Sometimes they think there's something else that they're buying rather than those. These are, they use precursors coming from the People's Republic of China, coming into Mexico. Then they are pressed into pill form in Mexico and then transmitted across the border. The CBP is doing an extremely good job of checking the trucks and checking the cars for this material, but it is an overwhelming problem run by the cartels. And the DEA is working extremely hard on this matter. When I was in Mexico City, I raised, with respect to the high-level security talks that we recently had with their security ministers, secretaries, I raised precisely this issue.
Gentleman's time is